I customarily, Skip Bayless, do not believe in moral victories. You either win or you lose or what have you. But in this particular instance, it just proves that there are exceptions to every rule, and I definitely think that's applicable here. The fact of the matter is the Denver Broncos could have folded. They were down 17-3. The Seattle Seahawks were pretty much manhandling them, at least on the defensive side of the ball. It was a replica of what we had seen transpire in the Super Bowl. And so, as a result of that, whether it's the Cam Chancellor interception that ultimately led to a field goal with a little less than a minute left, whether it was them pressuring Peyton Manning, whatever the case may be, their defense was pretty much having their way with the offense of the Denver Broncos. But then all of a sudden, here comes Peyton Manning. You've got a turnover. Ultimately, you pull it within 17-12. They go to 20-12, and then all of a sudden, in less than a minute, you march this team down the field. You connect with Tammy for a 26-yard touchdown pass. You connect with Demaryius Thomas on a two-point conversion. You tie the game, and in large part because your defense held and was able to hold them out of the end zone and prevent Seattle from really running away with it. I've got to give credit where credit is due. I thought that when you look at, if you're looking at John Elway and you're looking at the acquisition of DeMarcus Ware, of T.J. Ward, of Aqib Talib, who had a tip that led to an interception, by the way, DeMarcus Ware, who had a sack, forcing the safety in the end zone to when they gang tackled Marshawn Lynch as well. I just look at Denver's defense, and I clearly see an upgrade. Got a lot of heart. They responded to the challenge. They didn't fold. And it was the kind of game, to be quite honest with you, that we expected in the Super Bowl. So I definitely think that when you look at Elway and the Denver Broncos organization, they made the necessary upgrades. Of course, they lost the game. Of course, they were manhandled for pretty much 3.5 quarters. I'm talking about Denver's offense. But Denver's defense obviously didn't hold Seattle in overtime because they marched right downfield. But credit Russell Westbrook and his continued elevation taking place before our eyes for a lot of credit as it pertains to that. But in the end, I'm just happy that we had a game, and I definitely think if there is such a thing as moral victories, we witnessed it yesterday for Denver.
So you're going to give the Denver Broncos a moral victory off that game yesterday?
Yes.
I can't even begin to do that. I am sorry. I'm with Richard Sherman. That game shouldn't have been that close. I'm very happy for the viewing audience that we got that game as opposed to what we got in the Super Bowl. And I wish that game had been the Super Bowl, because that would have been an all-time great finish to a Super Bowl. But, Stephen A., you and I have been covering sports for a long time. Early in my career, I used to believe in moral victories. And I've covered too many coaches who convince me they're just a loser's lament. Look at the scoreboard, who won and who lost, and that's the ultimate takeaway, especially when we're talking about the greatest regular season quarterback in the history of the National Football League in Peyton Manning. I did not give my Cowboys a moral victory last year when they played Peyton to 51-48 and lost on a late Romo interception, even though Tony Romo threw for 506. I did. If ever I've seen a moral victory over the last, let's say, 10 years, it was your Giants. Remember the last regular season game of 2007 when they proved to themselves they could hang with Brady and Randy Moss in that game, which set up the Super Bowl victory over Brady and Randy Moss, unfortunately. Maybe that's a moral victory, or maybe it's just figuring out how to play against somebody that was the biggest offensive juggernaut in the National Football League history. But in this case, this was a 17-3 game at halftime, and I thought it was going to be a blowout. And I didn't think it was so much what the Denver defense did in the second half. It's what the Seattle offense failed to do. They had 103 total yards in the second half. And I'm not being a hypocrite. I tweeted about this. In one drive, they targeted Brian Walters 4 times. In one drive, Brian Walters, an undrafted free agent from Cornell, who, you know, covers, returns punts, just because Earl Thomas is a little too dangerous back there. But what are you doing? You have Percy Harvin. You have Kurse. You have Doug Baldwin. What are you doing throwing to Brian Walters? That's what it degenerated to in the second half. It looked like they were just trying to run out the clock, a lot of Marshawn, and all of a sudden we had a game capped off by 2 masterpiece drives. Two of the greatest drives you will ever see under these circumstances of a Super Bowl rematch. We had Peyton Manning, Big Peyton, doing big things, in 59 seconds with no timeouts to score the touchdown and the two-point conversion. And then in overtime, we had Little Russell doing a whole lot of little things to go 80 yards in 13 plays. They were beautiful drives to watch for very different reasons. They went at it completely differently. But in the end, if I'm looking at strength of team, Seattle's just still way better, I think, than the Denver Broncos. And I thought Seattle got way too conservative in the second half. If they'd kept their pedal to the metal, I think it would have been a blowout because it teetered on that in the third quarter.
Well, the thing about it is I get where you're coming from, Skip, but when I look at a guy like Emmanuel Sanders, 11 receptions, 149
he had a great
yards,
game.
who was clearly more of a significant threat than an Eric Decker, I think that's a plus. I think when you look at Wes Welker returning for the first time, having 6 receptions, a relatively pedestrian 60 yards, but we understand where that's coming from. There's a downgrade from Noshawn Moreno to Monty Ball at the running back position. We understand that. Peyton Manning had some pressure, but was still a bit better protected than we saw him be protected in the Super Bowl. I think the combination of things, you can take nuggets of information, peel it from the game, and say to yourself, if these two teams met again, what kind of a matchup could it be? And I think that's where I'm going with it. I certainly believe that the Seattle Seahawks are still a better team, but when you look at the way Denver responded to the challenge, how they didn't fold like cheap tents, being in hostile confines in Seattle with that noise and everything else, but still being able to tie this game and force it into overtime, you see some of the lapses in Seattle's defense. I don't believe that Seattle's the same team they were last year. I do believe they're still the best, but I don't believe they're as head and shoulders above everybody as they were a year ago because of the absence of depth.